ambition, conquest, lust, murder, and the power of unrivaled technology. These are the cornerstones in the foundation of the Roman Empire.
They were driven by a kind of collective cultural ego.
Rome's colossal building projects, stadiums, palaces, roads, aqueducts, span 3 continents and unleash the power and promise of the world's most advanced civilization.
These structures became symbols of that idea of Rome.
But while the Romans dominated the landscape with massive feats of construction, they were ultimately powerless to prevent their own self-destruction. March 15th, 44 BC. The most powerful man in the world lay lifeless on the floor of the Roman Senate. As a general, he nearly doubled the size of the Roman Empire. As a politician, he engineered a stunning rise to power. But now this battle-scarred warrior had been slain in Rome and by Romans. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar.
Caesar's rise to power was predicated on him wanting to have the best standing in the Roman state. He seemed to want too much power for himself. He did not share power with others, and this was what led directly to his assassination.
Decades earlier, as an ambitious young general, Caesar had recognized that the road to glory in Rome began on battlefields far from it. His thirst for military conquest would spawn the construction of one of Rome's most intimidating feats of engineering. '55 BC. Julius Caesar is leading 8 Roman legions, a total of 40,000 men, north through Gaul, a Roman province encompassing modern France, Belgium, and Switzerland.
He wants to go to Germania, to Germany, and cross the Rhine because no Roman commander has yet done so. He wants to be as great a conqueror as Alexander the Great and go beyond what is known.
The Rhine River lies on the edge of what is known. For centuries, it has been a buffer protecting Germanic tribes from Roman expansion. No previous army could cross it with the might needed for conquest. But Caesar is unlike any previous warrior.
He could have gone by boat, but what is that for Julius Caesar to go by boat, man? Rowboat? You know, you're gonna put 8 legions in a rowboat and row across? No, man, they gotta march across. They're gonna be on horseback.
From the engineering point of view, the difficulties in constructing a bridge over such a river are enormous in relationship to the depth of the water and the forceful current. If you bear in mind that this had to be done in a short period of time due to military needs, the work is actually truly exceptional.
The bridge would need to be 4 football fields long and sustain the weight of 40,000 soldiers. Despite the Rhine's width, depth, and strong currents, Julius Caesar is determined to succeed.
To cross a river that size with a bridge is something which plays well with an audience back at home, but of course it's something that plays extremely well with the audience standing on the other side of the river, who are going to be awestruck when they see this happening.
With the speed and efficiency of a well-oiled machine, Caesar's soldiers methodically transform local timber into an expanding bridge. With every hour, an engineering miracle inches closer to the Rhine's elusive northern bank.
It's almost as if a spaceship were to come down nowadays, the size, let's say, of half of Manhattan, capable of with some magnetic device or the like, lifting buildings up into the air, that would be a pretty frightening thing, something that we couldn't really grasp at all.
The foundation of the bridge was a series of wooden piles driven into the bedrock of the river. Each pile was 1.5 feet thick. Toward the middle of the bridge, they had to be up to 30 feet tall to reach from the surface to the bottom. By driving the piles in diagonally, Caesar's engineers added extra stability to the bridge.
When they drove the pilings in at an angle and then connected them, in many ways they were doing what carpenters do when they build a sawhorse. With the legs angled, it utilizes forces to keep it from being pushed over and makes it a stable workspace.
The sloping pile gives them a lot more strength against the force of the river, and flooding of the river and so on, but it's much more difficult to drive them into the riverbed than it is to drive a vertical pile. So they would have had to work very carefully with wooden frames to push them into the riverbed.
On the upstream side, the piles leaned in the direction of the current. 40 feet downstream, the corresponding piles leaned against the current. Each set of piles was joined by a long connecting beam 2 feet thick. Lengths of timber were then laid across the beams, and the surface was finished with tightly wrapped bundles of sticks. The design of the bridge itself was innovative, but what made this engineering feat even more astounding is the speed with which it was built. Just 10 days after ordering its construction, Caesar marched across his bridge and toward his destiny.
If we tried to do that today, we would never be able to build something like that in so few days with that kind of technology. We could match that feat today if we had thousands of loyal, sweating soldiers totally dedicated to Caesar and the objective of getting across that Rhine River to terrorize the Germans beyond.
Caesar had estimated the size of the Germanic forces at 430,000, more than 10 times the size of his own army. But when the Germans saw the Roman legions rolling over the Rhine, they quickly fled to higher ground. For the next 18 days, Caesar freely explored the territory north of the Rhine, encountering no resistance. Then he crossed back over his bridge and dismantled it, having made an unmistakable point.
It is symbolic of this. Rome can go anywhere. There's nothing going to hold Rome back. And to distill it even farther, Julius Caesar can go anywhere.
Caesar's bridge was an early indication of his single-minded ambition. A decade later, that ambition would propel him to unprecedented power, but it would also prove to be his downfall. When he was declared Rome's first dictator for life at the age of 55 in 44 BC, whispers of assassination began to echo through the halls of the Roman Senate.
He makes certain moves that suggest that he might want to have been worshipped as a god, that his ambition really goes so far beyond the limits of what the Romans themselves, and in particular Roman senators, felt to be acceptable, that he was assassinated.
In life, Julius Caesar forever altered Rome's political landscape. In death, he would embody both the potential and the peril of absolute power.
When Caesar was assassinated, there was no guarantee that anything would happen except that Rome would fall apart completely.
This assassination caused an enormous shock and naturally provoked great uprising among the people as well.
Caesar's reign was a major turning point in Rome's political history. His conquest of Gaul greatly expanded the reach of Roman influence. His consolidation of power marked the death of the Roman Republic, ruled by democratically elected senators and consuls, and the birth of an empire in which tyrannical emperors could rule with absolute authority. Some would use their power to build magnificent engineering marvels. The vanity, excess, and ignorance of others would push the empire to the brink of destruction. Through it all, Rome would grow into the most powerful and technologically advanced civilization the world had ever seen. Today, Rome is a 21st century city where the ancient and modern collide.
C'è da imparare da Roma ed è tutto, tutto.
From Rome, we can learn everything. Everything. Because Rome was the set, let's call it, of the history of the world for at least 1,000 years. Rome is the center of an immense empire, which began in Britannia and stretched to Armenia, and then to Africa and to Germany. It was an extraordinary empire.
Roman legend says the city was founded in 753 BC by Romulus and Remus, two brothers who were abandoned as infants and raised by a she-wolf. The two brothers set out to build their own city on the banks of the Tiber River. But a disagreement over who would rule it ended in murder. Remus was killed at the hands of Romulus, for whom the city of Rome is named. It would not be the last time bloodshed produced a new Roman ruler.
Civil war actually is one of the very defining features of the growth of the Roman state. The story, the tradition of Romulus and Remus is one that reverberates and echoes throughout Roman history.
Initially, Rome was one of countless small kingdoms jockeying for power in central Italy. But unlike many of its neighbors, who were suspicious of outsiders, Rome was a safe haven for ambitious outcasts.
Romulus, he said, given the fact that we don't have any population, I'll create an asylum. I will create a sort of a free zone for anybody. Runaway slaves, brigands, pirates, whoever. Come and be part of this great idea, which is Rome. That's a very unique attitude. And said from the very beginning, it seemed that the Romans were very open.
This openness encouraged a free exchange of ideas. Among them were engineering theories imported from other cultures. By borrowing the technology of neighbors like the Etruscans, Rome expanded into a regional power.
The Romans had an extraordinary ability to take from the technological past and adapt it to their own purposes, and to refine it and to improve upon it. They were able to take from these Etruscans the technology of road building, of moving water systems through tunnels, of building large, extraordinary walls, and produce something which was based on Etruscan technology.
The city's first major engineering achievement was the Cloaca Maxima, an extensive sewer system which still functions today 2,500 years after it was constructed. The Cloaca Maxima flushed runoff from Rome's city streets into the Tiber River. Engineers also used the sewer's underground pipeline to drain the marshland between Rome's hilltop villages. There they built the Forum, ancient Rome's downtown district.
The construction of the Cloaca Maxima is the key event in transforming Rome from a series of tribes living on disparate hills around a swampy marsh into kind of centralized, unified culture. The new Roman Forum that resulted from the draining with the Cloaca Maxima really allowed that culture to consolidate in one central place.
While Rome's culture was consolidating, the influence the city had over its neighbors began to grow. By the 4th century BC, Rome controlled most of central Italy, and its engineers were called on to develop a transportation infrastructure that would connect the expanding empire.
In antiquity, there were basically two modes of transportation. There was transportation
through the countryside, either on horseback, but probably walking or in carts, or that there was travel by ship. The roads, as we understand them today, basically didn't exist before the Roman Empire.
That all changed in 312 BC, when the Via Appia was built. Rome's first national highway stretched 132 miles from the capital to its southern province of Campania. To plot the straightest and fastest route down the coast, Roman engineers used a specialized surveying instrument.
The Romans relied on the tool called a groma, which was a vertical pole that stood in the ground with a cross on the top, and you could sight along this cross to line up 2 points in a straight line. The big difference with Roman roads and modern roads is that the Romans couldn't survey a corner, so they were all dead straight, and then they would turn a sharp angle and then go dead straight in another direction. The challenge, of course, with building a dead straight road in any direction is that you come to hills and valleys and you have to cross them. So if they had to, then they would cut through the mountains in order to take the road straight through.
Once the ideal path was cleared, a broad trench was dug and filled in with sand and boulders to form a solid foundation. Next went a layer of gravel compacted with clay or mortar. The top surface was a layer of thick paving stones angled to allow the water to drain off to the side.
For the first time, a stable paving was made. It was a paving that could stand the test of time. It would be able to withstand the frequent travel of wagons, as well as, subsequently, that of all the armies.
The roads were incredibly intimidating. You could look at a road and say, I wonder how long it takes to get a couple of legions, 10,000 guys down this road, you know, right into my backyard. I think I'll think twice about starting any nonsense with Rome.
By the time of Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, Rome controlled most of Western Europe and North Africa. It had defeated Carthage a century earlier, making it the Mediterranean world's lone superpower. Caesar's eventual successor was his great-nephew Octavian, who was renamed Augustus and crowned Rome's first imperator, or emperor. Under Augustus, the Roman road network expanded to reach the farthest corners of the empire. And with the highways paved, it was time to build new destinations.
Under Augustus, we can see popping up everywhere Roman-style cities equipped with a forum, with a theater, with an amphitheater, with a basilica, and all of the other markers of what made a Roman city.
To the recently conquered natives of the provinces, the new cities were a powerful endorsement of the Roman way of life.
People would flock to the new cities, these urban centers, which were symbols of civilization, higher standard of living, incredible jobs. That's where the money resided, and people would go, as today, will go where the jobs are. And ultimately, the people in these conquered nations would really embrace these Roman ideas.
The Roman city itself was the greatest image-creating device, I believe, that the Romans had. And those cities survive today. London, Bonn, Paris are all testaments to Rome's expansion of its culture through its cities.
Rome's engineers had a secret weapon that enabled them to build bigger, stronger, and faster than anyone else. Waterproof concrete, mixed with a volcanic sand called pozzolana.
Early concretes were just a simple lime-mortar mix, which, although they would set, weren't very strong, and indeed the particles in the early concrete could easily break apart. But in Roman concrete, the pozzolan sand reacted with the lime, and it makes a concrete quite like a modern concrete, much, much stronger.
A mortar of the hydraulic type, instead of the air-entrained mortar, which was formerly used, introduced a material which possessed enormous resistance. It could set in water as well. It was durable and proved itself the fundamental element in the development of Roman architecture.
During the age of Augustus, this concrete solidified Rome's chokehold on Western Europe, allowing Roman builders to dominate the landscape with massive man-made monoliths. One in particular would revolutionize daily life in Rome for centuries to come. By the 1st century AD, Rome had emerged as Europe's sole superpower. And as the Romans expanded their empire outward, they also looked inward and used their superior engineering skills to improve the quality of life within the walls of the capital city. Of all the achievements of Rome's engineers, none were as life-altering as running water.
Rome's system of water distribution was a quantum leap to anything which had come before it.
In the capital city, 11 aqueduct lines guided a steady stream of fresh water to its citizens, carrying a combined 200 million gallons a day into the city from mountain springs miles away.
What the aqueducts did was really revolutionize the daily life of Roman citizens. Not just the gardens and the villas of the wealthy or the palaces of the emperors, but the average Roman. So much water was available in the city of Rome, and this sustained an enormous population.
The aqueducts fostered the growth of a new urban culture. With a constant stream of water, up to 1 million people were able to live cleanly and comfortably in the capital city.
And it's the water from the aqueducts which can flush out the human filth and keep your city clean. This is another reason why the Romans think that they're superior. It's because they're cleaner than everybody else.
No single emperor can claim credit for the success of the aqueducts. They were built over the course of several centuries. But it was the disfigured, stuttering Emperor Claudius who arguably had the greatest impact on Rome's water supply. Before he assumed power, Claudius had been a royal laughingstock who was considered an invalid and even hidden from the public eye.
Well, he had an awkward gait. He constantly moved his head, and his laughter was excessive. And he was not very graceful. Above all, he also had problems with his salivation and such, possibly making him look quite unpleasant.
In spite of his shortcomings, Claudius was cunning enough to seize power when an unlikely opportunity presented itself. In 41 AD, most of the royal family was murdered to avenge the bloody reign of Claudius's nephew, Caligula. But Claudius was spared after he was found cowering behind a curtain. With his life hanging in the balance, he managed to bribe Rome's Praetorian guards into proclaiming him emperor. His timely bribe would change the course of Roman history.
Once he became emperor, he seems to have ruled in many ways, at least by our standards, well. He clearly was not a stupid man.
During the reign of Claudius, the empire took several surprising steps forward. On the frontier, his legions conquered Britannia, something even Julius Caesar failed to do. And back home, he built 2 major aqueducts, the Aqua Claudia and the Anio Novus, which dramatically increased the amount of water flowing into Rome.
Aqueducts are not that complicated in theory. That is that water seeks its lowest level, and therefore that you can run water down a slope from any area to another area. So that's a pretty simple premise that everybody would have known. But that the practice of creating an aqueduct is another thing.
The Romans engineered their aqueducts to approach the city on a gradual declining angle, or gradient. That gradient was just several inches every 100 feet.
The slope of the aqueduct had to be calculated from great distances, 20, 30, sometimes even 40 miles, from the source in the mountains to the cities themselves. That had to be consistent. They couldn't deviate from it, regardless of what the terrain was.
To maintain the water's precise descent through high mountains, Roman engineers dug perfectly angled tunnels through them. When the pipelines reached low valleys, they were elevated on stone walls. If the walls needed to be higher than 6.5 feet off the ground, the Romans saved building materials while still adding strength by perfecting an ancient engineering concept, the arch.
The arch revolutionized architecture in the ancient world by permitting far greater spans than had been allowable before. They basically changed the spatial conception totally of Roman architecture.
Arches were built around a temporary wooden framework that held each stone in place until the keystone was laid in the center. The keystone evenly distributed weight down each side of the arch, allowing builders to stack additional stones above it.
Arches are improvement upon building just a straight wall in a variety of means, both in terms of their efficiency and in terms of their strength. The arch, of course, takes much less material to build. Arches are very strong at supporting things like roofs and aqueducts and whatever you want to put on top of them.
A 6-mile column of arches carried the Aqua Claudia across the valleys on its way to Rome.
The aqueducts would have had a covered roof, but of course if you could take the roof off, you could see the water like an open river coming down towards the city.
After reaching the city, each aqueduct emptied into 3 holding tanks. One for the public drinking fountains, a second for the public baths, and a third reserved for the emperor and other wealthy Romans who paid for their own running water, a concept that was well ahead of its time.
Basically, every home by the 1st or 2nd century AD of any means had running water. This is astounding, because the entire span of the Middle Ages, they didn't have this.
With the construction of the Aqua Claudia and the Anio Novus, Emperor Claudius had revitalized Rome's system of water distribution. His public record was one of success, but the choices he made in his private life would ultimately lead to his downfall.
The tradition about Claudius is that he was uxorious, that he loved his women and his wives in particular too much, and was subservient to them.
He sent shockwaves through the empire when he married his own niece, Agrippina, the conniving sister of Caligula.
Agrippina came from a line of ambitious, popular, and powerful women. She was kind of in some ways the Cleopatra of her age.
She was headstrong, she was proud, and she was ambitious. She was terribly ambitious.
After having been surrounded by emperors her whole life, Agrippina was hungry for her own taste of power. She used all of her physical and political charm to attain it. And once the aging Claudius was under her spell, she used her only son as a means to perpetuate it.
Agrippina's main intent in seducing Claudius and becoming the empress was to ensure that her son would accede to the throne.
In 50 AD, Agrippina convinced Claudius to name her son from a previous marriage as his heir, instead of his own biological son. 4 years later, Emperor Claudius was dead, poisoned by a mushroom, and his wife's ambition. Overnight, Agrippina had gone from being the wife of one emperor to the mother of another. His name was Nero, a 16-year-old tyrant in training who would engineer disaster. 64 AD, a small fire spreads into a week-long inferno that reduces huge swaths of Rome to ashes and leaves thousands homeless and walking the streets.
The fire of 64, the fire of Rome, was something. It was an enormous tragedy. The fire burned almost 3/4 of the city. And since the entire city was comprised mostly of houses, particularly those of the poor, and was built with a lot of wood, everything went up in smoke.
Number 1 on the list of arson suspects is the emperor himself. Nero was supposedly seen playing his lyre at the top of a nearby tower as the fire raged.
He's said to have looked at the fire as though it were a spectacle, and to have gone to the Tower of Maecenas and recited the fall of Troy. The tradition is that Nero was fiddling while Rome burned.
His actions after the blaze were just as incriminating. Nero confiscated 1/3 of the charred city as his own personal property, and set out to build the empire's most extravagant monument to self-indulgence, a palace complex covering some 200 acres of downtown Rome.
The rumor starts to spread that he had set the fire intentionally so as to clear a portion of the city where he could build this palace.
Nero blamed the fire on a new religious cult called the Christians, and had hundreds of them strung up and burned to death in the streets of Rome. This was just the latest in a string of horrifying acts that solidified Nero's dysfunctional legacy.
He served up the head of one of his ex-wives to his new wife as a present on her request, and then later kicked her to death when she was pregnant in a fit of rage. Most of the acts for which Nero is most infamous come after one of the most heinous acts one can commit, the killing of one's own mother.
Agrippina, who had orchestrated Nero's rise to power by killing her husband Claudius, was antiquity's most overbearing mother. She expected to share power equally with her son.
He decided to eliminate his mother. He tried several ways. The first time, he tried to poison her 3 times, but she had taken some potent antidotes and was able to survive. Shortly thereafter, he was watching a Naumachia, which is a naval show where sea battles were reenacted and ships were sunk. It was there that he became inspired. He had the idea of using one of those ships to facilitate his plan. So he rigged a ship which picked up Agrippina and escorted her to the bay. Then, at precisely the right time, the ship sank. But even this wasn't enough to silence this lady, this virago, if you will, because Agrippina managed to swim to safety. Eventually, Nero was forced to send some of his hired assassins to kill her. It was at that point that he got rid of her once and for all.
As they closed in, Agrippina symbolically ordered the guards to stab her in the womb.
She said, "Strike here first." This bore Nero. Very dramatic.
Nero was haunted by visions of his mother's ghost for the rest of his life. Visions which pushed him further into madness.
Nero, as time goes on, becomes more and more lonely, and at the same time, perhaps also therefore more and more paranoid and more cruel.
It was in the midst of his deepening delusions that Nero began building the empire's most lavish pleasure palace on public land and with public money.
You'd have to imagine the whole of Central Park is transformed into Bill Gates' personal estate and pleasure palace. And this is in the heart of the city where the rich and the affluent and the people who have a part of the city itself once had their homes. It was shocking.
Nero bled the provinces dry to get money for that. And also in Rome, he demanded money from the rich. They had to bequeath him their money, and then they would be offed. It must have been a very scary time to be alive.
Nero's golden house was built on the pain and sweat of forced labor. In ancient Rome, slavery was a common and acceptable practice. 1 in every 3 people living in the city was a slave.
Rome's achievements would be unthinkable without slave labor. This slave labor was part of what generated the profits necessary to maintain and to expand an empire. There's no question that slave labor was also very significant for the building of these grand projects that really define the essence of imperial Rome.
Nero's new palace would reflect his godlike perception of himself. It was designed to evoke a sprawling seaside villa in the heart of the city. Vineyards, gardens, and pastures for wild animals would cover what had once been Rome's downtown crossroads. The center of the complex would be a man-made lake, and the pavilion with covered walkways a mile long. A vast 150-room wing of that pavilion still survives today, buried beneath modern Rome. Its cavernous interior demonstrates Roman mastery of another engineering innovation: the vaulted ceiling.
A vault is nothing more or less than an arch which has been extended along an axis. Once you've built that framing one time and built one arch, move the framing, build another, move the framing, build another, you have a long vault. Very efficient way to build for the Romans.
When the Domus Aurea was completed after just 4 years, Emperor Nero exclaimed, "Finally, I can begin to live in a house worthy of a human being." The surviving remnant is a dank shell of the decadent palace he inhabited. These brick and concrete chambers were once trimmed in gold and covered with colorful frescoes and priceless gems.
There were semi-precious and precious stones embedded in the ceiling, so that there's lapis lazuli and rock crystal and rose crystal that were just put up to catch the light.
And in building the Domus Aurea, Nero is showing that he is not, like good emperors, generous with his personal resources, and I think this is one of the things that leads to his downfall. His behavior was so far off the scale in terms of what senators and people in Rome expected out of their emperor that I think he ultimately paid the price.
In 68 AD, just months after he moved into the Domus Aurea, Nero was overthrown by a tidal wave of opposition. He was declared a public enemy by the Senate and hunted like a fugitive by his own guards. As they closed in on him, Nero slit his throat with the help of a loyal slave. His last words were, "What an artist dies in me."
Nero died like the grandiloquent actor he always wanted to be, a kind of tragic actor upon a tragic stage. So his final words really do complete a picture of somebody who saw themselves not as an emperor, but as a star.
After Nero's death, the Romans sought to bury any memory of him and his oppressive reign. By 104 AD, his golden house was filled in and covered with dirt and rubble. It would form the foundation of a bath complex built above it by the Emperor Trajan. For the next 1,300 years, it lay buried and forgotten beneath a changing city. Then in the 1500s, a sinkhole led explorers back into the belly of the ancient beast. Inside, Renaissance artists drew inspiration from its bizarre frescoes.
The very word grotesque that we use today is actually an artistic term to describe these strange creatures that they saw down there that were part human, part beast, part architecture, part decoration.
The Domus Aurea is an enduring testament to Nero's chilling reign, one marred by madness, mass murder, and extreme self-indulgence. When that reign ended, the Roman Empire faced an uncertain future. Every emperor from Julius Caesar through Nero had been a descendant of a single bloodline. Now, for the first time, rule of the empire was left up for grabs.
No one was sure really what was going to happen next, except that it was going to be bloody and it wasn't going to be very good until it was over.
'69 AD, Emperor Nero lays dead, killed by his own hand. For the first time since the murder of Julius Caesar, Rome is left without an heir to the throne. A power struggle erupts between the empire's top generals, who turn their armies on each other in a bloody bid for power. The ultimate victor is Vespasian, a simple, straight-talking general who had commanded Rome's legions in the volatile Jewish outpost of Judea. He is not of royal blood, and he is nothing like his tyrannical predecessor.
Vespasian was the anti-Nero. He was as different from Nero as one could possibly get. He had come up through the ranks, and he was a practical, kind of hard-bitten man who was averse to pretension and proud of it. Vespasian's the kind of guy that would much rather watch a football game than an opera.
Unlike Nero, who exploited the skills of his engineers for his own colossal vanity projects, Vespasian would put Rome's greatest architectural minds to work for the people. He would start by draining the massive lake that Nero had built on his palace grounds. On that site would rise Rome's most famous engineering marvel, a place where all the chaos that had consumed the city could be channeled. It would be called the Flavian Amphitheater, though we know it as the Colosseum.
So the statement that Vespasian made was, I am taking a space which is only for the private use of a bad emperor, and now I'm transforming that area into a public space which will be then used for the enjoyment of all the people of Rome. So that was a very bold piece of propaganda.
Gladiators had been spilling blood in the name of entertainment for centuries. But the people of Rome were hungry for bigger, bolder spectacles. The Colosseum would give the gladiators a permanent, state-of-the-art killing field, and the games would take on a level of carnage never before seen in the empire's history.
But this was the big venue. This was the Superdome. The entertainment came to you. Everything from animals from the farthest corners of the known world to captives from faraway lands could be brought to your central location, to your favorite box seat, and right in the center of the city.
It's undoubtedly the biggest amphitheater in the world, an exceptional monument for its dimensions. It's also exceptional for the organization of the work with which it was built.
Construction on the Colosseum began in 72 AD. It was financed by the sale of precious relics taken from the Jewish temple during Vespasian's sacking of Jerusalem. "12,000 Jewish captives were brought back from that campaign to build the amphitheater.
They would have worked under tremendously harsh conditions and been worked long and hard and to the end.
They poured more than 6,000 tons of concrete and hauled huge travertine building blocks to the site from a quarry 20 miles away.
As the building progressed up higher, they would use less of the strong, expensive and heavy limestone and more of the cheaper ingredients, which were lighter in weight. The Romans had quite sophisticated wooden cranes and devices for lifting stones, and they'd be able to do that quite easily from the ground and up to great heights.
In just 8 years, the imposing structure grew to 160 feet tall, dwarfing all that surrounded it.
It's the tallest ancient Roman structure ever built. This is the amphitheater of the capital. So what was Rome? Rome was a city that was so much larger than any other city. It was so much richer. So that came to symbolize the power, the engineering, the wealth of ancient Rome.
Roman amphitheaters were constructed from a surprisingly simple framework, incorporating 2 Greek theaters back to form one 360-degree theater in the round.